Well, it's interesting to obviously prepare one's speech in a vacuum, as it were, but so much has been mentioned already, and I was rather struck last night. We were given that book by J.C. Kapoor, which has the subtitle, A Call for Wisdom. And I think what I was trying to do here, I'd like to start with, and I noticed it has a quote from the Katha Upanishad, and what I had in mind was to start with a quote from the Isha Upanishad, which in English translation reads, "Whatever lives is full of the Lord. Claim nothing, enjoy, do not covet his property." And I chose this verse because, in a way, it reminds us of what humanity is, but also I want to focus on this aspect of property rights. So, and I've used Tolstoy as the way of approaching it, because Tolstoy was born into an aristocratic, wealthy, landed family, but he obviously became very uncomfortable about his comfortable, luxurious life, some would say, but all around him there was poverty on the land. But he was particularly shocked, as somebody mentioned this morning, when he came to Moscow in 1881 to see the dreadful poverty on the streets, beggars on the streets and that kind of thing. And he did what many, many people do today, try to help them. And you've got a number of famine relief. I mean, there's a very famous one in England, Oxfam, Oxford Committee for Famine Relief. They go out into the world to try to relieve poverty. And Oxfam hit upon a slogan, I think it's come from Lao Tse, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach him to fish, you feed him for life. Now that's true, and a lot of modern policy is based on improving education, and certainly it does help. But what's missing in that analysis is if someone has learnt to fish, he then goes off to fish, and he comes along and the landlord says, but just a minute, this is my land. You can't fish here until you have paid me or agreed to give me the first fish you catch, maybe even two fishes. So here you begin to see a fundamental division in society: those who regard themselves as owners of land, and those who work and have to pay for the privilege of access to land, which the universe has given to all of us. Now, one of the interesting things, and this was an aspect that was brought out by an American. So I know we've had quite a lot of anti-American, and I'm not American, and I think America has many good qualities. It also has its faults, like all of us. And but it's interesting that in America there was a man called Henry George who wrote a very famous book trying to deal with this issue of poverty. Why was it? This was in 1879, where America had more or less expanded to the west coast, right across the whole. So they'd occupied the whole continent. And so the westward drive was more or less at an end. But what he noticed was that as America, as a country, was getting richer, so for the first time, real poverty was beginning to appear. And so he wrote this famous book called Progress and Poverty, which was published in 1879. And it became a worldwide bestseller, translated into many languages. And one of the people, it must have been I don't know. Tolstoy got hold of it and read it. Initially, he totally misunderstood it. Well, I say totally, but he misunderstood it and thought that Henry George was suggesting the idea was to nationalize land. Well, any of you who know about Tolstoy will realize that he was very much against the power of the state, which he felt used power to coerce people. So initially he was against it. But later on, I'm not quite sure when he changed his view, but I just happened to find this quote which describes his view of Henry George's work. And he says, they do not argue with Henry George's teaching. They simply do not know it. There's no other way of dealing with it, for a man who becomes acquainted with it cannot help but agree with it. So that was in one of his books called A Great Iniquity. I'm not sure what the iniquity was. I only discovered this yesterday morning from one of my authors. But what I thought I'd read you is, well, first of all, that how enthusiastic Tolstoy became as a solution to this problem of poverty, that he wrote to the Tsar in January 1902, and he began his letter as, "Dear brother, I consider this form of address to be most appropriate, because I address you in this letter not so much as a Tsar, but as a man, a brother. I did not want to die before telling you what I think of your present activity, what it could be, of what great good it could bring to millions of people and to yourself, and of what great evil it can bring to those and yourself if it continues in the same direction in which it's now going." Well, we know what happened. This was 15 years later. But one of the interesting things is, just to give you a flavour of what Henry George was about, in 1891, Pope Leo XIII issued one of his encyclicals also concerned with this issue of poverty. So poverty down the centuries, or certainly in the last two or so, has been a major cause of concern. Why is there so much poverty in the world? And addressing the Pope, he couched it in religious terms. But as we've heard this morning, the emphasis in any change in Gandhi and anyone else, Tolstoy, does need to have a spiritual basis. So, though it's couched in Christian terms, this is what he wrote. "This world is the creation of God. The men brought into it for the brief period of their earthly lives are equal creatures of his bounty, the equal subjects of his provident care. By his constitution, man is beset by physical wants, on the satisfaction of which depend not only the maintenance of his physical life, but also the development of his intellectual and spiritual life. God made the satisfaction of these wants dependent on man's own exertions, giving him the power and laying on him the injunction to labour." So in other words, nothing can be created without work. That's our condition. A power that of itself raises him far above the brute, since we may reverently say that enables him to become, as it were, a helper in the creative work. God has not put on man the task of making bricks without straw, as the Pharaoh did in Egypt. His providence to live their lives, with the need for labour and the power to labour, he has given man the material for labour. This material is land. Man physically being a land animal who can live only on and from land, and can use other elements such as air, sunshine, water and land only from land. Being the equal creatures of the Creator, equally entitled under his providence to live their lives and satisfy their needs, men are equally entitled to the use of the land, and any adjustment of that denies this equal use of land, denying this equal use of land is morally wrong. Now, it's interesting, recently I saw in a London paper in July, the current Pope Francis, as you know, is very concerned about poverty, and he apparently called a conference specifically to find a more moral kind of capitalism. So Henry George goes on, being created individuals with individual wants and powers, men are individually entitled to the use of their own powers and the enjoyment of their results. There thus arises, anterior to human law and deriving its validity from the law of God, a right of private ownership in things produced by labour, a right that the possessor may transfer, but of which to deprive him without his will is theft. This right of property, originating in the right of the individual to himself, is the only full and complete right of property. It attaches to things produced by labour, but cannot attach to things produced by God. Now that's an echo of the Isha Upanishad, which I quoted earlier. Thus, if a man take a fish from the ocean, he acquires a right of property in that fish, which exclusive right of property he may transfer by sale or gift. But he cannot obtain a similar right of property in the ocean, so that he may sell it or give it or forbid others to use it. Or if he cultivates grain, he acquires a right of property in the grain his labour brings forth. But he cannot obtain a similar right of property in the sun which ripened it, or in the soil in which it grew. So the world in which we live currently, pretty well everywhere, the right of property is recognised in the things we produce, but has also been extended to what is provided by the universe. In other words, we've extended property rights to which, in Henry George's terms, is the gift of God or the gift of nature. Now, Adam Smith recognised this, and there's a lot in his Wealth of Nations, and there is amazing what you can find in it. But here's a quotation which he clearly recognised this. Civil government, so far as it's instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. So that is the present state of affairs. And if we really do want to relieve the world of poverty, we do have to face up to this, that our natures is such that we cannot live without access to land. Everybody's got to have somewhere to live, somewhere to work. We here have to have somewhere to sit and somewhere to stand. That is our nature. And that nature is given to us by God, by nature, universe, whatever you like to call it. So that's a very fundamental point in economics that is ignored by modern economists. Now, George was not a communist in the early Christian sense of suggesting that land and everything should be owned in common. He recognized the need of the individual to reap what he had sown, or to own the factory, office block, or house he had built. But he also saw how reform could be introduced peacefully through a change in the tax system. The effect would be to give everyone the same right to use the gifts of nature without requiring a right of property over nature. If we take the example of somebody's house, there are two elements to it. There are the bricks and mortars with which it's built, and there's the land on which it stands. Well, the bricks and mortars clearly are somebody who's made it, whereas the land, nobody does. And as a simple analogy we could think about, when you go to the theatre or on an aeroplane, you buy a ticket, and so you can validly say, this is my seat. But it doesn't mean you own it, and you don't need to own it. And it's the same with the land. You can validly say, this is my property, where I've got my house, my office, or factory, whatever, but you don't need to own it. So the question, therefore, really is, nobody's going to build a factory or a house unless they have secure possession. So how do you deal with that? So what Henry George proposed was that everybody should pay, he called it a tax on the value of the site. Because if you think about it, no two sites are equally valuable. In London, for example, if you've got a good school near where you live and you've got children, that will add something like £50,000 to £50,000 to the value of a house. So that extra value in your house has nothing to do with you, but the amenities around you. So what Henry George recognized was that this value, which is created by society, should rightfully belong to society. And if the government collected that revenue, not as the owner of the land, that gets away from the idea of nationalisation, but simply as the tax collector, that would enable the government to get rid of many taxes, possibly all taxes. So in effect, we would all pay a rent for the site on which we have our property and pay no taxes. And the effect of that would be that there would be a finite income for the government, which would be very high. I mean, in a city like London, the value of property is enormous in central London, so much so that the man who built Canary Wharf to move the city from the central site out to the docklands, he was prepared to build and pay for the extension of the Jubilee line because he realised, and he was going to give it to the government, he realised that his rents, as long as he could get over 100,000 workers to his offices in an hour, his rents would go up from £20 a square foot to £50 a square foot. So he would pay for building this in 5 years. That's how valuable land in a place like the centre of London is. Hugely valuable. Just one sort of final point. What people don't realise is how the market value is determined. You know, if you live near a railway station or a good road. I mean, in England, it's been a source of irritation in newspaper articles, the fact that Amazon does a huge amount of business in England, but pays virtually no tax because it's got a tax office in Luxembourg. Whereas if they had this system, Amazon, in order to service its customers, has to have huge warehouses. And those warehouses can't be stuck in the back, you know, out in the country. They have to be stuck near or built near road junctions, communication junctions. Now, property there is very expensive because many other people want it. So in this way, you would get away, there wouldn't be possible for big corporations to avoid tax in the country where they're doing the work. But there are many other advantages which flow from this simple reform. But I hope I've just given you a taste of what the basic principle is, that the earth is something which belongs to all of us. It's not private property. However, what we make, that is ours, and that we can give, sell, or whatever. But here's an interesting thought from Cicero, the Roman lawyer, philosopher. Now, if nature hath given us law, she has also given us justice. For as she has bestowed reason on all, she has equally bestowed the sense of justice on all. Therefore did Socrates deservedly execrate the man who first drew a distinction between the law of nature and the law of morals, for he justly conceived that this error is the source of most human vices. So what he's suggesting is that justice is the law of nature. But we have to obey the law of nature, otherwise we will not have justice, however much we may want to. Economics, like physics, is a science, and there is a knowledge that makes the economy work. I mean, you've probably heard, I saw an article on the Times saying that economists were the only people who could keep their jobs when their predictions proved to be false. Thank you.